Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion on strengthening America's democratic credentials. We come to this discussion at a time when democracies around the world, here in the US included, are under threat. My name is Pam Fessler. I'm a former NPR News correspondent and today's moderator. We're going to be talking today with a panel of democracy experts about the challenges facing US elections, declining public confidence in election results, and what can be done to address these problems and to restore America's credibility as a global role model for democracy. This webinar is one of 40 events being held today as part of the Global Coalition Forum, which is a virtual 24-hour event on the eve of the White House Summit for Democracy, which is going to be held later this week. The purpose of these events is to spur a global conversation on democracy, and the main messages and conclusions that we come up with today, and hopefully we'll come up with some conclusions, will be communicated to the organizers of the summit. So we encourage you to visit the Global Democracy Coalition website, which is www.globaldemocracycoalition.org, and attend some of the other events being held today. And if you're going to tweet about today's webinar, please use the hashtag Global Democracy Coalition. Before we get to our panel, we have a pre-recorded message from Jocelyn Benson, who is the Michigan Secretary of State. Secretary Benson oversees elections in her state, and she's been a national leader in warning about some of the threats to our democratic institutions, especially those that have emerged since the 2020 elections. Here's Secretary Benson.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's discussion. Thank you also to the Carter Center for bringing us all together. I do not believe there is a more timely or important topic. We are in an era of disinformation, and it is threatening the foundation of our nation. This is not hyperbole. It is fact. In the past 24 months, Americans have been inundated by an unprecedented volume of lies and misinformation about our elections. Now, a majority of Republican voters believe the 2020 election was unfair, as do a third of all voters. Unfortunately, even prior to this onslaught of misinformation, voters had real reasons to be frustrated with government. For decades, they have watched their legislative districts get increasingly gerrymandered, robbing them of the power of their votes in districts where the outcome of general elections is a foregone conclusion. Gerrymandering has also further polarized our politics, resulting in gridlock that increases voters' belief that the system at best does not work for them, and at worst is broken altogether. Unfortunately, state legislatures across the country have responded to voter frustration by trying to break our democracy further. Rather than seeking to correct the lies with truth or bolster the nonpartisan nature of our elections, legislators are fanning the flames of conspiracy and installing partisans into positions of election oversight. They are no longer seeking to overturn the results of the 2020 election, but they are using the lies about it to make it easier to overturn the results of the next one. Add to all of this the rise and acceptance of violent rhetoric and imagery, even after the outburst of tragic violence that disgraced our Capitol on January 6th, and we find our nation at a moment of acute vulnerability. I posit for your consideration today that more violence, less responsive government, and elections that are truly unfair or wrongly overturned are real possibilities for America's future. And if any of those were to occur, we will need to ask ourselves if we're still a democracy at all, let alone the beacon of democracy to the rest of the world. That is why today's conversation is so important and timely. Now is the time that Americans across the country and across the political spectrum must come together to protect our democracy and our nation. We must counter election lies and misinformation with truth and data. We must hold accountable the leaders who spread these lies and condone violence. We must strengthen our system by making it more accessible, less partisan, and more representative. In this regard, Michigan can serve as a good model for other states. In 2018, long before the pandemic, our citizens overwhelmingly voted to amend our state constitution to expand voting rights and create an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. My department then implemented these changes, including no excuse absentee voting and same-day voter registration, ahead of the 2020 election. We carried out a completely transparent application and selection process to place 13 citizens on our independent redistricting commission, and they will vote on what will likely be much more competitive maps at the end of this year, so that they are in effect for the midterm elections. We did all of this in record time by replicating the best practices of other states that had already done so much pro-democracy work. And because we were able to do this, I know other states can as well. The citizens of Michigan came together and launched pro-voter initiatives to expand their voting rights and improve our democracy. And that is what it will take nationwide for us to prevail through this vulnerable moment for our nation. But by working together, all of us, regardless of political perspective, and speaking the truth and protecting our democracy, we can prevail. I know this, and I know that conversations like the one you will have today are part of starting that process. And so I thank you again for your participation today and the work I know you will do in the months ahead to ensure our democracy continues to be the shining light that it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. Some very sobering words, and I'm sure that our panelists will have a lot to say about it. I'm very pleased to present these three top election and democracy experts who we have today. First, we have David Carroll, who's director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. Welcome, David. Nate Persily, who's the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. Nate, hi. And Ashley Corku, Senior Director of the Democracy Programs and Pillars at the Partnership for American Democracy. Thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate it. I thought maybe we could start just talking a little bit about trying to frame the problem on what we see right now as the main threats to U.S. democratic institutions, and just, what is it that's driving those threats? Nate, maybe you could start.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the Carter Center for putting on this event. Well, as Jocelyn Benson summarized, these threats are multifaceted and coming at every institution of our democracy. And so we can focus on the sort of elite action, whether it's voter suppression, gerrymandering, or election subversion, trying to overturn elections after the fact. Or we can look at what's happening at the mass level, which is a decline in confidence in American democracy and democratic institutions. And so that's a poisonous mixture. We really haven't been in this particular situation before, and it's not clear how we get out of it. And so the loss of confidence that we're seeing in the election infrastructure and Americans' democratic institutions are the things that I find most troubling and most concerning, because we know from comparative politics that once you lose trust in democratic institutions, it's extremely difficult to build it back. And so that really is the challenge of our time here in the US for those of us who care about American democracy. And while I am afraid of a lot of these elite moves to change the laws to make voting more difficult, to subvert elections, what's happening in the mass public is equally concerning.
Ashley, where do you see the major threats coming?
Well, I certainly agree with Nate about the threat of the crisis of public confidence. Just to put a finer point on it, a recent poll out of Grinnell College noted that over 50% of Americans feel that democracy is facing a major threat. That's a large majority of the country that is deeply concerned. And obviously, this is an outgrowth of the delegitimization of the election process, but it builds on overall longer-term trends that we've seen for decades in terms of declining trust in government. So certainly we're at an acute moment now, but we are also consistent with this long-term trend. I think a second factor is the way that sort of our norms around democratic processes have also really broken down. So democracy really depends on fundamental agreements on the rules of the game. We have to agree that losers are going to accept the results. And they do so because they perceive that those rules are legitimate and because they're going to have a chance to compete for another day. And right now, our electoral rules are deeply contested. And collectively, we don't agree on the process by which we're going to change them should they need to be changed. And it's normal for rules to need to be changed over time. We've done this throughout our own history many times as we've had to expand the franchise and other kinds of reforms. But right now, we're deeply contesting that process as well as the rules themselves. And that makes the rules become delegitimized as a result. Another kind of quick point I would make is that, we are in a long-term decline in terms of access to local news. Decades-long, again, trend accelerated over the pandemic, where over 60 local newsrooms alone closed during this pandemic period. And this is despite the fact that people have a greater demand for local news. That's particularly acute in a time of crisis, like an election crisis, where people really need local coverage of what's happening in their own communities. And so I think that exacerbates what's happening now. And then I make one final point, which President Biden often talks about making democracy deliver. And when he's discussing kind of the legitimacy problem that democracies have globally and the ways in which democracies have not always produced optimal policy outcomes. And certainly that's a feature of American democracy as well, where we have extraordinarily high levels of income inequality, for example, higher than any other G7 nation. So it's just an important recognition that democracy is not just about process, it's also about the results.
Thank you. David, anything, other threats you can think of?
Well, I'd like to also just acknowledge agree. There's very sobering comments from Secretary Benson, and agree wholeheartedly with everything that both Nate and Ashley have said. I think the only thing I might add, and it's, in a way, it's just expanding a bit, the fact that Americans seem to be really experiencing living in separate realities and separate worlds, this sort of disinformation aspect and the polarization, the result of that is that there really is a fundamentally different view of what's happening in our society. And I think it's connected as well to the underlying social demographic changes in our country and how that's playing out and feeding into the polarization. And I think maybe the last thing that I would underscore is all of this is showing kind of the limits of our aspects of our Constitution and our political system. Many of us have long been aware that compared to international standards, the U.S. political system and the way it conducts elections have a number of very serious defects. And, for the longest time in the post-Cold War era, for a good 20 years or so, and during the Cold War, there was a great deal of confidence in U.S. elections and U.S. authorities. But as we've seen in the last 10 years, increasingly the last 5 years, those kind of long buried defects in our Constitution and our political system, I think, are painfully obvious for us to see. So I would just go back to maybe the opening words of Secretary Benson. We are facing an acute crisis, and our democracy is at serious risk.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of those international standards. What are those international standards that you think that the United States isn't quite meeting anymore?
I think maybe the two of the most important ones link directly to aspects that Secretary Benson mentioned. The inclusive participation in the political process. International standards require that the broadest possible pool of eligible citizens, voters, are able to have access to the elections, to register, to vote without any undue obstacles. And we know that both there's a lack of a uniform system across the United States. Again, we're relatively unique in how decentralized we conduct our elections. And that also allows for a great variation in how elections are conducted. And the fact that because states have under the Constitution the ability to organize great aspects of elections, there's a great disparity. And so there's undue obstacles to to universal suffrage, universal participation. That's the first one. The second major one really has to do with impartial election administration. Around the world, when we work as international observers, one of the most important things we want to ensure is in place is that there is an independent election authority that has full autonomy in administering elections in a non-partial way, and that there's public trust and confidence in that. And we have seen increasingly the partisanship play itself out in ways that are increasingly destructive in U.S. elections. So I would underscore those two probably most. There's others, but to be brief.
And Ashley, I'm curious how you think. Obviously, the United States for many years has seen itself, at least, as this model for democracy around the world. How much do you think that this erosion of our system has diminished our ability to be a role model, or can we still even be a role model, especially after January 6th?
Well, I think that we certainly have been and should continue to be a strong leader, a strong voice on standing for freedom, for human rights, for democracy globally. And I certainly don't think we should cede that space because we faced our own challenge and continue to face challenges. I think certainly what has happened here in the United States, especially this past January, very shocking and damaging. But there are important broader messages about what's happened here that are also important. The ways in which our institutions showed resilience, the ways in which our sort of transfer of power took place anyway. For us, this isn't our first kind of challenge. It is the most acute challenge that probably we've all faced in our lifetimes, but it isn't the only one we face, and it won't be the last. And so we do have an opportunity to take this moment and look at what we should do in order to make our system more resilient to the next threat. And this is also a way that we can serve as example to other nations. But I also think that we are sometimes too quick to think about what lessons we can offer in this sort of rhetoric around us as a model. I think this is a moment that gives us the opportunity to be much more open to learning what we can from other places, and along with sharing our own experiences, of course. But I've found that in my own work that looking at how other places have addressed certain challenges, for example, contested elections, where we know globally where just based on where these things tend to be contested in other places, where we're likely to see problems. And we know globally that the post-voting counting, tabulating, results management process is often a place where we have problems and where you need to plan around that. And that's something we can learn from global experience and how we can approach these things better. So.
Yeah, I would like to, I think there's pretty broad agreement on what the main problems are. It's just trying to figure out what the solution is. What are the most urgent things that we as a country need to do to address this erosion and these problems, especially the ones that we have seen emerging since the 2020 elections. And I wonder, and Nate, maybe you could start a little bit first. I'd like to sort of break it into short-term and long-term. What are the things you think are urgently required to address this? And you spoke a lot about this lack of public confidence in U.S. elections.
Well, let me start with a note of pessimism, as if we haven't had it enough already, which is that so long as we do not have bipartisan support for expanding and buttressing our democracy, it is going to be extremely difficult to achieve these aims. And so you can do all we can do from the sort of government and civil society side to try to increase trust. But so long as signals are being sent to the mass public in a polarized way about that an election was rigged, right, or that that you cannot trust the machines or the administrators or whoever else, there's very little that we can do, I think. It's just a familiar mode of public opinion. It's the same kind of thing with vaccines. It's the same kind of thing with other kinds of signals that are being sent by elites, that if you have polarization and the signals that are being sent, really, it's very difficult to counteract it. Let me also say that I am worried that we're going to actually have bipartisan signaling of a lack of legitimacy in the electoral system come next year if the Democrats lose Congress, which I think is likely. So while right now there's a partisan valence to this lack of confidence that it's possible you'll even have a bipartisan loss of confidence, which is really something to be frightened of. So where are the bright spots and what can we do? So it remains the case that the farther down in the system you go, the less controversial many of these infrastructural democracy questions are. So that, as many of you know, Charles Stewart and I started this Healthy Elections project last year to help local election administrators deal with COVID. And for all the Sturm und Drang that you see at the national level, when you deal with the local election administrators, they just want to get the job done. And these are professionals who are, there's much less partisanship and posturing than you see at the national level. The problem is that we're seeing record retirements of these veteran election officials, and their jobs are becoming, untenable in a lot of ways. They're risking their lives in many cases. And so that's disconcerting. But the more support we can give to the local election officials, the better off that I think we will be as a country. Beyond that, there are plenty of rules changes that I have on my wish list in terms of restoring American democracy, whether it's some of the stuff that's in the, what was once called HR1 or the For the People Act or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I have, I would pick and choose among the various options, and they're happy to get into it. But I do think that one thing in supporting these local election officials, and this is a kind of bipartisan drop of the ball actually, is that we should be committing ourselves to several $1 billion a year in election funding for these locals. So that while a lot of these machinations that we're seeing at the state level in terms of restrictive voting laws are very troubling, if we gave the resources to the local election officials, they would be able to work around them to try to promote voter turnout and to make sure that people have access to the ballot.
Okay, great, thank you. And David, what sort of is sort of on your top list of the things that are most urgently required that you think might address some of these problems that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I agree a lot with everything really that both Ashley and Nate have said, and maybe just try to bring out a little bit of some other aspects of that. I do think that the local officials are extremely central to this and really important. So I think Nate's point about trying to find the lowest level that we can to try to where that kind of it's less politically divisive, there's more confidence, they really are concentrated on wanting to get the work done, is an important thing to emphasize. And the degree to which there can be more funding made available to them and more support to them in all the ways that are possible, because that really is, at the end of the day, at the end of the road, those are the ones who are doing the work, and there tends to be less distrust of them and less partisan divisiveness around the local election officials. But I think we could also, try to bring in some of the aspects of greater transparency, more public understanding of what happens at local election offices, because so much of the disinformation, that's out there might possibly be able to be addressed by more frequent windows with public explanations about what's happening in this office when they're counting absentee ballots, for example. How does that process work? How can we introduce more elements of transparency and public understanding to elections so that there's less ability to be swayed by some crazy thing on social media? And just more generally, ways to check the accuracy and verify that the results are what they are. Greater use of a good practice of risk limiting audits and other post-election legal audits under law.
So it's interesting, we have talked about, and Secretary Benson brought this up as well, that the impact of mis and disinformation. And I know there's a lot of effort to try and help voters understand exactly how the process works so that they're not confused. But I'm curious, Ashley, do you think, one of the frustrations that I've had as a journalist is I feel like, I can report things, the truth and facts until I'm blue in the face, but there is this core group of people who are just not going to believe it. That they are convinced for one reason or another that the system is corrupt, and no matter what you do, they're going to believe the disinformation. So do you see that as a problem, and do you see that any way to kind of get at that?
Well, I think that this is a huge problem, and we didn't sort of name this in our top line list of our threats, but certainly, maybe we alluded to this sort of siloing of our community in terms of information, but the sort of active role of mis and disinformation is clearly a huge threat to democracy, and is driving a lot of the other issues, or exacerbating, I should say, the issues that we've been discussing today. And I think that the election kind of universe is one major kind of sphere where it becomes critically important to deal with it. But of course, it's a broader societal issue that's impacting, the pandemic response and a whole range of other issues. And so I think as a greater kind of societal effort to get a hold of how we address this. And some of those have to do with general strategies around, things like media literacy and things like this, right? The sort of investment of in people and their ability to assess and make judgments about the information that they're consuming, to sort of find diverse places where they're getting their information, to know how to get to the what are the credible sources around which they can seek answers. And that's something that when David said about giving people better access to the counting process and all of the sort of post-election processes, it's also about where can people go? What are the sort of credible resources where people can know that I can go to this source and it's going to provide me with information that I can trust. I think that's a piece of it. I sort of imagine, what if we, like when you go to the doctor and you find out that your child gets a vaccine, and you get the sheet about what it is and what might happen to you at the end of it. What if voters left the polling station and had that sheet, which told them what was going to happen at the end of their voting experience, and where they could find information if they had questions, and where they could lodge a complaint if they had something to report. But where are those very specific places where we can point people as well? If I could, Pam, I just also your previous question about short term and what should we do? I'd love to just quickly zoom out for a second around from the election conversation, and just to say, at the Partnership for American Democracy, one of the things we're trying to do is to think about what is a sort of comprehensive vision for how we can strengthen democracy. And we talk about this through 5 pillars. And election integrity, citizen participation, good governance is definitely one space. And I think we were identifying here an urgent space where we need this urgent attention, as is information, media, and technology, where we're dealing with this threat of misinformation, is also a critically acute challenge. But we've also got 3 other pillars that are focused on, I'd say, more the longer term things that we also need to do, and which I think we sort of challenge ourselves to think to not lose sight of those as we're trying to both address the urgent and need to address the longer term. And those include things like investing in civic learning or civic education, right? Very under-resourced area in this country, where we're trying to build that civic knowledge skill and sort of the disposition of being a productive participant in civic life. We also talk about national community service, in terms of thinking about the agency that we all bring to solutions in our communities, and the work that it's going to take to bridge divides, cultural and political divides, in the context of a society which is increasingly pluralistic and diverse. So I think all of these things are important. I think it's hard to triage and to find what's the highest order priority. But I think we should also think about not lose sight of some of those longer term areas as well.
Nate, do you want to add anything to that? Especially looking at the sort of the long-term solutions, but also to address the this issue of how do we deal with this disinformation? Which is undercutting so much confidence.
Yeah, well, here's the problem, and this is not unique to the United States. If a presidential candidate loses an election and says the election was stolen, his or her adherents will believe that the election was stolen. There's almost nothing you can do to try to distract from that because people trust the horses they rode in on, right? And so that it is extremely difficult to shore up, particularly in this environment in the United States, bipartisan institutions that can counteract partisan sources of disinformation, particularly over the election. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't do all of the things that Ashley suggested. They're good, not just in the political realm, but outside the political realm, right? But unless we, other countries have figured out ways to, build institutions that send signals to the mass public about the legitimacy of elections. So that, but the idea, for example, of us having an election court, right, in the U.S. or an election, administrator, as many other countries do, is impossible, right? As many of you know, I'm in the midst of all kinds of redistricting controversies right now, and gotten appointed with some of these commissions and the like. And it's almost, you're seeing some of these commissions, completely dissolve because you're trying to create bipartisan efforts to regulate American politics, but we're so far apart that it's impossible to do so. And that is in part the disinformation problem, which is that unless you have trusted sources by both sides, it's going to be very difficult if you have one side that is promoting a kind of democracy endangering message. Now, unfortunately, because the disinformation problem has been tied up with sort of new technology, we're now looking to Facebook and Google to try to become the referees of American politics, right? And to some extent, they have no choice but to do that, right? So that their decisions, and Twitter as well, to kick off President Trump, in the wake of January 6th was, the kind of thing that you would see, in other political systems where the government might take a role. And so we've essentially outsourced to them a lot of these policing functions because we don't trust either because of First Amendment problems or because of a lack of trust. We don't have government authorities that can do this. And so now they're in this position of determining how they're going to deal with, say, disinformation in elections, disinformation about the election infrastructure, when people say, go vote on a Wednesday, as well as all kinds of things dealing with political advertising and the like. So grappling with that problem, developing new institutions to deal with content moderation on the platforms is, I think, a long-term challenge that not just we're dealing with in the US, we're dealing with around the world.
Actually, David, I'm interested in, obviously at the Carter Center, you do so much work internationally looking at observing elections around the world. And I'm curious if you think that there are lessons, or what are the lessons that the United States might be able to learn from other countries that we can apply to the current threat that we're facing?
Yeah, I think it's an oversimplification, but generally the more transparency that can be built into election systems, the better. And the more that election authorities can be seen as independent and impartial, the better. I mean, a lot of what we've already talked about so far today, shows us how, there's no easy quick fix to the way our elections are administered. It's going to require, constitutional or legal changes that, will be time consuming and may, as Nate has suggested, be politically difficult right now, given the partisan nature of how we're looking at these issues. But from international experience, Mostly it's about transparency to try to build public confidence in election authorities, and talking to major parties and candidates in a way where they can say they trust the election process and they commit to accepting results because they know that it's going to be administered fairly. I mean, we've had a candidate who said before the elections and after the elections and continues to say the elections were unfair, and that's a major problem when there's really, it's hard to know what to do about that if that's the stance of a major candidate. And that I think ultimately is one of the core threats, and the fact that it's so linked though to the other problems that we have, the polarization and the disinformation. So I do think in some ways it pulls us back to what can we do to address as quickly as possible. There's going to be longer term solutions, but also shorter term ones to address the disinformation that's swirling around. The fact that this large percentage of Americans have somehow believe that the elections were stolen.
So this is all not very encouraging,
I'm afraid.
unfortunately. And I guess I'd be interested what the three of you think it's going to take to get the political will to make any of these changes, because in many ways we seem to be going in the opposite direction. Is it going to take somebody actually stealing an election to wake up the American public? What do you think? Or am I painting too dire a picture? Ashley?
I like to be optimistic, but it does really concern me that what I believe Nate said earlier about we're going to have a sort of bipartisan delegitimizing of the election the next time when the House flips over to Republican control, and what happens when we get to that kind of moment of crisis. And so I do worry that that there won't be a sort of broader public awakening, but that even if there is a broader public awakening, that people are going to still be at cross purposes about where they see the legitimate threat coming from, right? That we aren't going to be on the same page about the nature of the threat, and that if we had a crisis of confidence, but people all saw the threat the same way, then that is a window of opportunity, right? That kind of creates this momentum around, okay, well, what are the reforms that we need to make to our system? And there are tons. There's however many pieces of legislation, nationally looking at various kinds of reforms. I mean, we're full of ideas. There's all the folks in the democracy reform movement working on open primaries and ranked choice voting to sort of try to bring greater participation into the voting process for people and broaden the electorate out. And so we have all of these great we have these great ideas were we to have the window of opportunity to move them. And so I think my greatest concern is we do have a crisis that doesn't do enough to bring us into greater consensus about the need for these broader reforms. So I hope I'm wrong. I hope both that we don't have a crisis or if we do, it certainly is galvanizing in a positive way, but that is an area of concern, which I know is not what you asked, which is for solutions.
Right. Well, it's interesting. So Nate, you were the I don't know exactly what your title was. I can't remember. You were, I guess, staff expert for a bipartisan commission that we had a few years ago that was really actually pretty incredible and did look at real problems that we do have. We do have some problems with our election system and tried to address them on a very bipartisan way. And I guess the question is, do you think it's possible to get back to that? And what will it take to renew this bipartisanship?
We won't be able to get back to that anytime soon. I can tell you because we've tried in one way or another. So just so the listeners know, so this was the Presidential Commission on Election Administration that started in 2012, 2013. Oh, no, excuse me.
think that's right.
The report we issued was in 2013, but it was following the 2012 election, and it was a joint effort by Bob Bauer, or the chairs were Bob Bauer, who was the White House counsel and campaign counsel for President Obama, and Ben Ginsberg, who was the counsel for both George Bush and Mitt Romney. And they got together and we worked with state and local election administrators, many of whom were on the commission, and I was the research director to issue, a very kind of nuts and bolts report on things like long lines on elections day, election technology, and the like. But fast forward to the commission that, for example, was stood up during President Trump's tenure, the Kobach Commission, right, which kind of dissolved in the kind of vote fraud conspiracy theories, right, that were motivating that, and that tells you where we are. But to answer your larger question, so here's where I was a few years ago. I actually thought the election of President Trump might help out polarization, in that it would scramble the party coalitions a little bit, because here was someone who was not actually, really a card-carrying Republican, and so maybe you'd see some shuffling. Whereas we see that didn't happen. And then I was thinking, oh, well, maybe a crisis would make a difference. And it's like, well, look, COVID is about as, pronounced a crisis as you could think, that would bring people together, add at least some kind of dimension. But no, we've seen a real partisan response to the government efforts in the COVID area. And then you might think, when you talk about a political crisis, well, how about an attempted insurrection? That seems like that would have been the thing that would focus the mind on issues of American democracy. And we're seeing a completely polarized response to that. And so if there is going to be a crisis that is going to affect our attitudes toward democracy, I actually don't think it's going to come from the democracy realm. It's not going to come from the election itself. It'll be a foreign policy threat. It'll be something like that might then scramble coalitions and lead people to sort of rethink some of their positions. But part of the problem now is that people are committed, right, to, among other things, the narrative that the 2020 election was stolen. It's not like, it's going to be very difficult to get elites who have made that commitment and who have voiced that support to then back off that position in the coming months and years. And so it's going to take a long-term sort of reformation of the process, and maybe a kind of reorienting of our politics before we can have that kind of bipartisan effort that was sort of the last successful effort at campaign reform and election reform that we did in 2012 and 13.
David, do you want to add anything? I mean, what do you see as the thing that might make some of these proposed solutions, which I think a lot of people agree on, actually happen or possible?
Yeah, I have to say I'm similarly pessimistic in the immediate term, but I mean, there are a lot of efforts to try to do things bipartisan outside of Washington. Efforts of getting former Republican leaders, former Democratic and Republican presidents, institutions to develop proposals and ideas. The Carter Center has had a series with the Baker Institute. We've looked at the Carter-Baker Federal Election Reform Commission recommendations from 16 years ago and how those might be looked at from today's perspective. So there's a lot of those kinds of discussions, but when you move it into the realm of politics in Washington, D.C., and this very, very polarized environment, it's hard to see how all the good ideas get translated. You said, how do we build political will? I don't see an easy way for that to happen right now, frankly. I do think in another, switching just to a separate point, if there's a way to start to address the lack of transparency around the social media algorithms, the profit, the monetization of a lot of the ads, and just sort of the way things are represented on social media, if there's a way to try to mitigate some of that, focus on the role of super spreaders and getting misinformation into the broader conversation, ways to try to address some of those things in the near term, while we hopefully can get through the next one or two election cycles because there's a lot of great ideas for reform. That many of them are, a great deal of consensus among organizations that have been talking about this. But it's translating it to politics in Washington D.C. and the state legislatures where the problems are.
Can I just say one thing on that for those who are interested? I testified in the Senate a few weeks ago, and I proposed, if you go to my Twitter feed @personally, the Platform Transparency and Accountability Act to do exactly that. And in the coming weeks, you'll see a bipartisan group of senators who are going to release a version of that. I think that's good, not just on the democracy side, but it's good on the kind of transparency of internet monopoly side, which I think has a pro-democracy side to it as well, but is also good for the information ecosystem.
I also wanted to ask, maybe we could start with you, Ashley, or whoever wants to jump in on this. Do you feel like the American people actually appreciate the urgency of this threat? I mean, we are talking about it. Secretary of Benson mentioned, we might not have a democracy in 2024. People have warned. Do you feel like the American public, that maybe that is what needs to be done, that the American public has to have a better sense of what the threat is, that might generate more public will to address it? Ashley, do you think that's legitimate?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, again, we do have more polling that shows that Americans are deeply concerned about threats to democracy, that they equate, sort of democracy, I think, in elections very closely. So when they express concern for democracy, it's really, I think, closely linked to elections. I think Secretary Benson noted that there's an asymmetric kind of, that threat is sort of asymmetrically experienced disproportionately on the right right now, and not as much by, frankly, the people who accepted the election results of 2020 and who are satisfied with the result of it. Those people are not necessarily the ones agitated about the prospective future threat to democracy that I think we're pointing to. And so I do think there is a need to sort of activate that part of the country, as much as we might try to be engaging the part of the country that didn't see the 2020 election as legitimate. And so what that looks like, I don't know, but to the extent that we can sort of start creating tools and mechanisms to enable the public to engage, to sort of assess a democracy as a policy issue that they care about as much as healthcare or the economy, or at least assess their preferred candidates' behavior on certain issues as much as they would vote for them because of their policy positions. Maybe that is a way to sort of shift that, or to sort of bring that into the public debate about who we want to support. But I think it's hard because people are so polarized that their loyalty, and this is sort of a feature of polarized democracies, is that you become so attached to your group that even if your group is eroding those democratic norms, you'd rather vote for your group than somebody else who might be more willing to preserve those norms. But I do think it is important to figure out how to engage this group in considering kind of a pro-democracy agenda.
And I think you mentioned too that your group, I mean, one of the things that you have been advocating is also the government show that it can provide, that actually serves a purpose for people, that they can appreciate and feel that they're it's providing the services that they need.
Right.
So David, do you have any thoughts on that, about the whether the public is not sort of sufficiently frightened, or I don't know, or just understanding the urgency of that, and is that part of the thing that's preventing more response?
So I'm a little conflicted on this, because part of me thinks that the American public is not fully aware of the nature of the threat, that we, a little too much complacency that, things could never really break down in this country. Although I do think in the last 6 months, year, especially after January 6th, there's been, more awareness of this. But I still worry that just on a day-to-day basis, there's too much complacency and not a full recognition of how serious this moment is. On the other hand, I think, the flip side of the same thing is, this fact, as we've said over and over again in this session, this, different understanding of reality. So I'm not sure that, we might have people on the different sides of the polarized spectrum agreeing that there's an American crisis of democracy right now, but they would probably understand it differently, and that's, again, kind of brings us back to the nature of the problem. And I think if there's anything that we can do, it really is trying to increase the degree to which people can know and understand and see what's going on in the conduct of elections, especially around the counting of ballots and absentee ballots and all of those things, and then somehow try anything that we can do in that realm that would help people know that the election results are accurate and relying on trusted election officials.
Of course, one of the ironies of the 2020 election is there was so much more openness in the counting of ballots, and this was sort of used against the elections offices because people who were looking didn't quite understand what they were seeing, and then they thought, oh, that's a sign that somebody is like pulling suitcases of ballots out from under tables,
Right.
and other accusations. I guess they have to be very careful exactly how you are transparent. And so
Could I build on that just a little?
Yes.
Because I think you're exactly right on that. And then it does dovetail with the information sort of pollution that we were talking about before, which is how issues of election administration get repackaged to serve particular interests and to serve certain narratives. And it's going to be very difficult to counteract that. I'll say one thing that, these questions might look different if there's a competitive presidential primary on the Republican side in 2024, whether Donald Trump doesn't run or whether there's an actual, because then Republican voters really have no choice but to really believe in the system, in something, that there's going to be a process through which you have to choose who that nominee is, and that it will then seem like a less partisan enterprise, whereas right now it's like the idea of the administration of the electoral system is engendering partisan, or it's evoking partisan animosity and the like. So I think that's something. But I do agree that the transparency, while I'm 100% in favor of it, including live streaming of the ballots counting process and all that, for most people, and this goes to the core of your original question, for most people, election administration and democracy is not something they're thinking about 24 hours a day, right? It is, like many complex issues, it's going to get repackaged by people that they trust, and the signals that are sent by those elites, whether it's folks in the media or whether it's presidential candidates or other political elites, that those are going to be the signals that drive their opinions that will affect their feelings of legitimacy toward the system.
So, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a global democracy debate, and we are being asked to provide some either observations or advice for the organizers of the Summit for Democracy, which will be held later this week. So I'm going to give you, maybe we can close out if each of you have one or two messages that you'd like to get across to this the summit. Maybe you can offer them now. Ashley?
Well, I would just briefly say that I think our own challenges reveal the need for us to walk the walk in the same way that we're encouraging through the summit. We're encouraging others to do this. It's an opportunity, right? It's a moment created by the summit, which is an opportunity to both have a discussion, but also to sort of make some meaningful commitments. I agree that those kind of commitments, especially around elections or voting, are going to be hard politically, especially without bipartisan support. But there are other areas of democracy strengthening where the U.S. could make meaningful commitments, to consult with civil society on the nature of those commitments, and then to see them through this year of action. And that may be what we need to kind of get the public more engaged, if we can do this the right way, to see this as a critical issue that requires their attention.
Thank you. David?
Yes, I would say I agree with everything that Ashley has just said. I do think it really is what we do in the year ahead that's going to be essential, and that the summit, in spite of all of the criticisms that may have been made about it and how it's been structured, I do think it's important at this moment that we have these kinds of conversations, and we do use this opportunity that the summit and the year of action that's supposed to follow presents. And I think from the United States perspective, the best that we can do to be, a model, to claim the mantle of global leadership, is to really use this year to examine all the things that we've talked about in this session. Where are our defects? How can we try to address them? How can we hold ourselves more accountable to the deficiencies in our system, how we fall short of international standards, how we can provide for greater transparency, and how we can really allow for greater public engagement and public understanding, public education about democratic processes, so that there really is a popular confidence in these institutions that are failing so much. So I think if we use this as an opportunity for honest self-reflection, self-criticism, and dialogue, and identifying things that we can do to address these gaps, I think we will have gone a long way toward helping the Summit for Democracy be what it can be.
Nate, any suggestions?
Well, to reiterate what I said earlier, we need to invest in our democracy, right? And we've sort of taken it for granted, but it requires cultivation. It requires investment like other public goods. But it's the Supreme Court said that voting is a fundamental right because it's preservative of all other rights. And that's true of democracy, whether we're thinking about the pandemic response or infrastructure or any number of other global or national challenges. Unless we invest in the system of government and the system of elections, that we're not going to be able to counteract it and deal with all those other problems. And so the US should lead by trying to invest in our democracy as soon as possible.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, everyone. Really, those were really wonderful observations. And even though we sounded a little bit pessimistic, or maybe very pessimistic, I do think that you also talked a lot about, where there's hope and possibility for change. I want to thank everybody for listening in, and also to encourage you again to go to the Global Democracy Coalition website, where there are many other events going on today. And thank you to the Carter Center for hosting this, and have a good day, and good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Pam. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.